divided by the total area. I don't mean that. I mean the population divided by the developed area. Okay? So we exclude the jungles.
Because if we feel this you said 93.5, but I would like to see where is Bangkok. We can compare how is density of Bangkok. Where is it?
Okay, this is 20 years ago.
Okay, it's better.
It's 1995. Okay. So in 1995, Bangkok was a bit more dense than Singapore.
Okay.
But I was just saying that Singapore's density has been increasing slowly.
Okay.
Bangkok's density has been decreasing quite fast because new suburbs, car-oriented suburbs, have been developing at low density. In Singapore, we have not been doing that. And so it's actually becoming more dense. It's becoming more transit-oriented. Bangkok has become less transit-oriented because more people living far away and car-dominated. So today, maybe Bangkok is similar to Singapore, or maybe even a bit less. Okay? Sorry, just by the way, the really, really extreme places like Perth, Houston, Denver, Atlanta, they are very, very low density, like 10 people per urban hectare, about 1/10 of Singapore's density. So, gave it away. So here's a question. What percentage of households, what percentage of families in Singapore own a car? So Singapore's famous for making cars very expensive, right? But Singapore's also quite a rich place. So even the median income is fairly high by regional standards. So any guesses?
1 out of 10.
1 out of 10 households? Okay.
10%.
10%? Okay. 1 out of 10 saying? 5%. 50%, maybe you saw. Yeah, so actually, people are often surprised that it's more than you would think. Even though cars are so expensive, about 40%. That was probably the peak around then. And since then it's been going down. Singapore, the government changed policies in about 2010 with respect to cars. We'll see that later. So even though it's super expensive, 40% of households still invest in a car. I had quite an argument with my wife a few years back when we had a car, and there's an issue with the Singapore car taxes. The COE, which I'll explain a bit later, runs out. So when it runs out, you need to either get rid of your car or extend your COE or buy a new COE for your same car, or get rid of your car and get a new car. Okay, so there's various choices, but at the end of the COE you have a choice. It'll force you to think about whether you want a car or not. And I said, look, this is Singapore, we don't need a car. And she said, yes we do. That was the end of the discussion. But no, I tried. I said, look, we could get hundreds of taxi rides and Uber rides for this money. We could just, every time we ever want to travel, we could get an Uber or a taxi, and it would still be cheaper. Yes. You still need a car. So it is convenient to have a car. It is. I'm not saying cars are not attractive. They are very attractive, which is why it takes such a high price to get even only 40% of people to buy one. And amongst those people, there are some middle-class people for whom it's a really a big burden to have that car. So even in transit-oriented Singapore, where it is possible to not have a car, and it's, you can't say a car is a necessity in Singapore. Well, people do say that. Once you get used to having a car, the mindset is, I'm used to this is a necessity, I can't imagine going back to. So even in Singapore, that's difficult.
So Paul, you should kind of compare it to, like, for the price of a small Japanese car, you could get a whole flat with 2 bedrooms.
Yeah, so we bought a small Japanese car, a Prius C, right, the smallest Prius. So how much are you familiar with Singapore dollars?
Yeah.
Okay, so Singapore dollars, You could say it in US dollars or Singapore dollars. How much do you think a Prius C cost us, my family? This is why I was crying when I lost my argument with my wife, right?
The Thai baht is 25 to 1.
I'm not sure that in Thailand you have the same
Prius.
cost.
So, but any guesses how much? It's a very small Toyota, but it's a hybrid. The hybrid Toyota.
Hybrid.
So how much? It's a very small car. Some of you saw it. My wife dropped me off, right? That little green car. How much do you think that cost? 20,000? More? 200,000, no? Less. So 100,000 Singapore dollars, about 70,000 US dollars. For that little car. It's a bit shocking, right? So you get the idea. Okay, so, and the mode split, actually, despite all of the effort, Singapore has put in a huge amount of effort, but still it's not easy to get people to not buy cars and to not use cars. So even in Singapore, it's only about half or so of all trips are by public transport. Work trips, it's more, and the very recent, when this gets updated, they'll do a new household survey soon and I'll be able to update this information. My guess is it's improving a little bit now because they've been putting a lot of effort in. There's a couple of new MRT lines opened just recently. So probably it's creeping up. Public transport is still creeping up, but it's a slow process. It takes a lot of effort. So don't expect really, don't expect miracles in Chiang Mai or Bangkok or wherever. If you invest in public transport, you don't expect it to miraculously suddenly have a huge number of people, because you're battling two different trends that are in the opposite direction, right? You know, every year you improve public transport, but every year Thai people get a bit richer. It's the same in Singapore. Right?
Paul, you know how much for the Chiang Mai?
For what? For a car?
For the 44% off.
Oh yes, no, very, very low. Right? Yes. 5%. 5%. Okay, so just as an aside, a lot of the 95%, some of it's walking, but a lot of the other 95% is a lot of motorcycles, right?
Yes.
Okay, a lot of motorcycles. If we look at the example of Taipei in Taiwan, there is some hope that if you improve public transport, a pretty big percentage of people who now use motorcycles will switch to mass transit if you improve the mass transit. Now, the people who are using cars, they will switch for some of their trips, maybe a work trip. If you make parking at their office expensive, they might switch to go to the office. But for other trips, they will probably never use public transport again. So once people have a car, it's very difficult to get them to be public transport users. But their children, maybe, when they're teenagers, maybe you can encourage them. But motorcycle people can shift. So there is some hope for Chiang Mai, because it's not a car-dominated city. It's a hybrid, right? It's cars, motorcycles, and traffic saturated. So there is some hope. But what I'm saying is it's not easy. Even in Singapore, it hasn't been easy. Okay, let's talk about the 1970s. Quick question, yeah.
What should happen to the identity of the transportation?
I'm glad you asked that question, because we're about to talk about it. Okay, so the early 1970s. By the end of the 1960s, Singapore was enjoying some success. Okay, so independence from Malaysia came in 65, from the UK, Britain, 1963. Singapore was in economic trouble early in the 1960s, but the 1960s were a period of rapid industrialization, and the governments, the PAP government, the new government, the independent government's initial priorities were two things: industrialization, bringing investment, multinational investment to industrialize Singapore, and secondly, housing. Okay, so by the end of the 1960s, both of those had been making a lot of progress. Okay, so there were a lot of jobs, prosperity was rising slowly, but quickly, but from a low it was a poor place still. There was a lot of new housing like this at pretty high densities. But there was a problem. So this is the success. There's a huge surge in housing. People were shifting from substandard, overcrowded shophouse slums and substandard, overcrowded low-income settlements with shacks and wooden houses, and they were being moved into this kind of housing. But an industrialization was happening, so a lot of those people had jobs. They were becoming more prosperous. But that started to create other problems. All of that was happening, but there was not yet an urban plan. The old British urban plan was totally irrelevant and outdated, and the government had been building housing estates without really reference to any kind of plan. And then they realised, uh-oh, because traffic congestion started to get worse, car ownership was going up, motorcycle ownership was going up because people could afford more. And so they started to have traffic congestion problems, people having long trips to work because the industrial development was quite scattered as well, and they were not referring to a plan in that either. So they really, really needed an urban plan that was desperate. So again, in the late 60s, they started this urban planning process, and it was finished by 1971, and the famous 1971 concept plan was created. It was a strategic plan, meaning they didn't sort of set a target that Singapore will be like a blueprint in a certain year. It was not like that. They said, we have these strategies and we're steering the boat, and every 10 years we will adjust. And if we went too far that way, we'll adjust back. So it was a strategic plan. It was a transit-oriented strategic plan. A strong city centre. So the city centre would be compact with high-rise and dense. And you can only have a really strong city centre if you plan to have mass transit. So they planned to have mass transit, but there was no sign of mass transit yet. It was just buses. But they said, we want to have mass transit. So we planned the corridors. And it's a bit hard to see. The black lines are the expressways. So it wasn't perfectly transit-oriented because there was still quite a lot of emphasis on expressways. One big reason for that is the Singapore economy also depends on trucking between Singapore and Malaysia, and the industrial strategy relies on trucks, so lorries. So they wanted to have expressways so that the goods, especially for the goods coming from Malaysia and going to the ports, okay, and coming from the factories in Singapore and going to the ports. So these dotted red lines are the initial MRT plans. If you look at today's MRT lines, the green line and the red line are exactly where this plan put them. So they follow that much later.
What happened? I mean, why 40 years ago they realized that this kind of the plan will work?
So as I said, success, right? So they had economic success, and they had success in building housing, but they suddenly realised we've been building housing, but maybe we're building it in the wrong places. And we're building factories, and we're maybe building them in the wrong places.
What is the concept of TOD and that they come from?
Okay.
From the learning from the Americans, from the learning from the Europe, or somebody come up?
Well, okay, so in some background context is 1960s British planning was influencing Australian consultants who came here to help them, but there was a lot of thinking in 1960s England of how to, so in the 1950s and early 60s, European cities had seen a surge of cars into relatively dense cities, so they became traffic saturated. So there was a lot of thinking of how to rescue public transport and improve planning for public transport. And so some of that planning, some of that thinking was influencing Singapore.
So we can say that Singapore is the first country on the ocean that adopt this kind of idea.
Yeah, Hong Kong was doing similar things around the same time under the British. Singapore just recently a British, so a lot of interaction, people going to study in England. So The idea of new towns, of building new towns and connecting them to the city with rail. The British had been doing that since the 1930s. So that kind of style of thinking was still, so it was not exactly new. Stockholm was building new towns linked with rail. So it was European planning more than American planning was influencing Singapore. But even San Francisco built a BART system and they were thinking they would have nodes around BART stations. In the end, it didn't happen. Instead, most BART stations have parking lots and low-density housing, but they thought they would have TOD, but so far no TOD, or very little TOD in San Francisco region. So anyway, Singapore was not unique, but it was more vigorous in pursuing this than most other places, I guess. And it had the power, the government had the power to make these things happen and to follow through. So I guess that was an unusual situation. One final thing. Already at that time, they realised that they would not be able to allow Singapore to become a car-dominated place. So the plan said, this was an urban plan, but they said to the government, you also should limit car use and car ownership. And the government, surprisingly maybe, because it's politically difficult to do that even in Singapore, but surprisingly they said, okay, we'll do that. And they followed through on that. So now, that situation, the situation that plan came and the government said, okay, we will limit cars, I said that's surprising. One reason that was surprising is because public transport in Singapore in 1972, 1971, was terrible. The bus system was clogged in traffic. It was losing money. It was not being subsidised by the government, so the services were getting worse and worse and worse. People with cars were offering, they were becoming pirate taxis. So they would go along on bus routes in front of the buses calling out, and they're offering $1 trips in the same direction. So that was evidence that the bus system was failing, and it also made the bus system fail even worse. So the bus system was in real trouble. And so for the government to say, we're going to restrict cars, they didn't say this publicly yet, but they made the decision. For them to make that decision was rather brave, right? Because the public transport system, the alternative, was awful. So they had to have a very, very strong commitment that they were going to improve the public transport. It became incredibly urgent to improve buses because it was very, very bad and the traffic was awful, and it was going to be very hard to persuade the public that we should increase the taxes on cars and make cars expensive because the alternative was so horrible. So that probably sounds familiar, right? It would be difficult to persuade people in Chiang Mai or to pay more for cars or to pay more for parking or more for have a congestion charge when they say public transport is so bad. So it's a difficult situation. So for the next 40 years or so, or next 30 years or so, from early 70s till the early 20 teens, so you get 40 years, this more or less was the strategy, the transport strategy. So on the one hand, we will make cars expensive and limit car ownership and car use. Cars will be a luxury for people who can afford that luxury. We won't talk about cars as a necessity, they're a luxury. On the other hand, we will improve public transport and other alternatives and do transit-oriented planning. So most people can be happy without a car. So that was the sort of bargain. For those who were paying so much for cars, they also made sure the roads were efficient. So good roads, so there was quite a lot of road investment. And the ERP, part of the purpose of that, the road pricing, initially it wasn't ERP, but initially it was something else, but it was road pricing. The purpose of that was to make sure the roads would, if you pay enough, you can go. We won't make you pay a lot and then you get stuck in traffic jams. So that was the deal. Okay. they promised MRT, but there was no MRT yet. And in fact, MRT was only opened in 1987. So they had a problem. The buses had to be improved fast. So I don't want to get too much bogged down in all of these details about exactly how, but what they did was step by step make cars expensive to buy, so that by 1983 the taxes on cars are 175%. So it's cars almost tripled in price just because of taxes between 1972 and 1983. So in about 10 years, cars went from being pretty cheap to being very expensive. But 1983 is still, MRT is only just starting to be constructed. It's not ready yet. So how did they do that? So this is a different which came first question. And the answer to your question and to this question of which comes first, transit-oriented development, TDM is travel demand management, restricting cars, and public transport is you improve all of them step by step. You can't make one of them perfect before you even start on the other one. So one mistake cities make is they say, we'll do TOD and we'll do TDM, travel demand management, transit-oriented development. We'll do them after we've finished our mass transit. But that's a mistake. By the time you finish mass transit, everybody has bought a car. So this is the problem in Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur, right? But Singapore started to restrict cars and they improved the buses and they did a transit-oriented plan and they started doing that and they did all of those things step by step. They improved the buses. It was not just about investment, but part of it was investment. But they also improved the regulatory arrangement. Now, this is a slightly off-topic subject, but if you want me to talk about this, you can ask questions at the end. But the basic story is that the government gradually has been taking more responsibility for the buses. And they have options that allow competition for the market, but not on the road. So you don't have minibuses racing each other anymore. The buses have monopolies in their areas, but it's a well-regulated bus system. Just recently they've been changing again. Maybe somebody mentioned that yesterday, I'm not sure. But this is kind of a side issue. But the bottom line is, in the early 1970s, the Singapore government took some big steps to improve the buses. So there used to be 11 companies. They had franchises, but they were poorly regulated. In 1973, the government forced them to merge, 74, into one company. And on top of that, they imposed civil servants to be managers. So the government took responsibility that this bus system has to improve. We're not going to leave it to chance. We're not going to let the private sector screw it up. We're going to make sure, we put some civil servants in there to make sure it works. So the government took more responsibility, and this gradually evolved into a well-regulated bus system. But initially it was rather ruthless. They sort of said to the shareholders and the companies, well, probably they said this. My guess is they said, either we nationalise you, we sort of seize everything, or you can stay shareholders, you can keep the company, but we're going to make sure it improves. And that's actually a pretty good deal, right? Because it was losing money before. So if they could turn it around and make money, then the shareholders would still win. But it was a bit like a Godfather kind of, here's an offer you can't refuse kind of deal. So anyway, the buses did improve drastically. Between 1974 and by 1980, the bus system was much, much better. So the first thing was to improve the buses. MRT was not the first thing. They promised MRT, but the promise was a long, long way away. Okay, so let's once the MRT was built, Singapore transport starts to look a bit like it does now. A mix of MRT, buses, cars, motorcycles. So that was the early MRTs was like that. And if you've visited the system, then the map is now, actually I should have updated it. This blue line has now got a bit that goes over here. So there's one more line there. I should fix my slide. Yeah. So, and there's a couple more lines coming. So the system soon will be even bigger. I've got a map near the end of the talk which shows the system. Just to oversimplify a little bit, you may remember in Bangkok the first SkyTrain. Do you remember the initial idea was that the fares are quite pricey, right? And the whole capital cost, the government didn't subsidise, right? It was supposed to be a private sector thing. That's very unusual, and it almost always fails. And I think later on the government came in and helped out, and so the fares were reduced, right? Singapore never made that mistake. Okay, the Singapore government paid for the capital investment, the initial capital investment. But the system is expected to cover its operating costs. Even that is rather strict. In most places, there's operation subsidy. So, but capital cost is government, and so that's the bottom. That's the basics there. So, transit-oriented development also works well if your public transport system is well connected, so that buses connect with MRT, buses connect with other buses, MRT connects with other MRTs, so that people can. If you want to use public transport, you don't just want to go down one line, right? You want to go anywhere. So you may need to change from one line to another line, and that has to be easy. One problem in places like Chiang Mai, if the public transport is very weak, probably the time between buses is maybe 20 minutes, half an hour. And if you want to change buses to another bus, then maybe you have to wait another half hour. It's not attractive to middle class people.
Can you come back to the last one?
This one?
You mentioned about the bus arrangement operation of the bus.
So this has changed very recently, but this used to be the situation. The bus system had to cover its own costs from fares.
Is it possible?
With high density transit-oriented development, then bus systems can be profitable. So Singapore's bus system was profitable until recently, but the Singapore government now has changed its policy. So, it's in the process of changing. They haven't announced anything, but you can see that they're gradually moving away from this. Twice now they've injected money into the bus system to help the bus system. So they're gradually recognising that if they want a really good bus system, now a basic bus system can be profitable in a high density city. But if they want a really, really excellent bus system, they're going to have to inject some more money. Probably there'll be subsidy. They probably won't call it that. They've already found ways to inject some more money. For example, they used to make the bus companies buy their own buses. Now the government buys the buses and leases them for almost nothing. So they're giving subsidy, but in hidden ways at the moment. Later on, they may give even more. But that's because they have high ambitions for public transport. Near the end, I'll talk about these high ambitions. You remember, it used to be that Singapore was about efficiency and functional, and this old deal was that, okay, rich people can have cars are a luxury, everyone else can have good public transport, but it's basic public transport. Now the strategy is a little bit different. Now the government has higher goals for public transport. It wants even middle-class people and quite rich people to use public transport and non-car modes. Use Uber, taxi, car, but also use public transport. Hopefully some rich people and upper middle-class people will choose not to have a car. That's the sort of goal. That means you have to make public transport really, really excellent, including the buses. So that's a harder, higher ambition. But they're doing it step by step. Not there yet. So part of the process of improving things was walkways is part of transit-oriented development, covered walkways. Who should pay for covered walkways? Should the developer pay? Or should the government pay? If you build a real estate development near a mass transit station, who should pay for the sheltered walkway from your door to the door of the MRT? So there's arguments both ways. I mean, other people will use it besides your customers. It is good for your development. But if the government wants this to happen, probably they can't wait for the developers to build it. And of course, it's not your land, so you're building a covered walkway on the government's land. You have to have a negotiation. And in in Singapore, much of these covered walkways are funded by the government because they are between HDB and government buildings. But when it's with private buildings, there's often some cost sharing. So there's negotiations about these links. Orchard Road has various links, underground links, above ground links, and there's negotiations about cost sharing for those links. The city centre is increasingly getting underground links, linkways. Okay. So the government is step by step improving public transport. Priority for the buses on the road. We don't have any bus rapid transit in Singapore, but we do have quite a lot of bus priority on the roads, which is not perfect, but it's gradually been improving. There's less and less parking on the streets, and so it's easier to do this than it would be otherwise. Okay, so do you remember I said that the vehicle taxes kept increasing? So in 1983, they were 175%. In the 1980s, there was a problem. Immediately after any increase in the vehicle taxes, the car dealers would have no business at all for maybe a year. Only the super rich would buy a car for about a year and a half. Then people would start to think, last time the vehicle taxes rose, it was about 3 years between each. Probably there's going to be another vehicle tax increase again soon. I better start, maybe I should think about getting a car now. My car's getting a bit old, I should replace it. I'll do it now. And so then you would have a surge of people buying cars. And then the government would see this and say, we'd better raise the taxes. And then you kill the car dealers again. So the car dealers were going bankrupt. And then when there was a surge, they couldn't cope with the surge. So they were trying to think, how can we smooth things out? So the idea was to have this quota system to smooth out the fluctuations. It worked to some extent, but then the COE price also had its sort of surges, and markets have their funny quirks, right? So, but to some extent this did work, so that the purchasing of cars was smoother. And so the car dealers could have a business where they could sell cars at a sort of a regular pace, a fairly even pace. But it meant that the central government was controlling how many cars and vehicles there are. It's not just cars, but I say cars because that's the main. Now this has changed. They were allowing 3% growth, pretty steady growth. Now they've cut that back to 0. I'm slightly out of date with this slide because just a few months ago I should have changed the slide. So last time I spoke to you, it was still at 0.25, and now it's 0. I should have changed the slide. Okay. In 1974, the government started to charge a fee for people to enter the city centre.